History as it happens, September 10th, 2024. What happened to the Israeli left?
For the third time since its birth as an independent state, Israel is embroiled in a war with the Arab nations that surround it.
Capturing the west bank of the Jordan River and occupying the old city of Jerusalem.
The framework document proposes a 5-year transitional period in the West Bank and Gaza, during which the Israeli military government will be withdrawn.
The First Intifada was sparked by the deaths of 4 Palestinians in December 1987.
Today, the leadership of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization will sign a declaration of principles on interim Palestinian self-government. It charts a course toward reconciliation between two peoples who have both known the bitterness of exile.
Those Israelis who live in Hebron, those 500 Israelis, and who are creating an intolerable situation for the more than 16,000 Palestinians who live in H2, are not representing the real Israelis.
We have to impress upon Netanyahu that he has a public at home to whom he promised peace, and peace with security. We have neither peace nor security.
This bill is outrageous. It gives green light for the settlers to steal private Palestinian lands, and we will, Peace Now, alongside other human rights NGOs, petition to the Supreme Court in order to cancel this ridiculous bill.
From its origins in the 1960s to its heights during the years of the Oslo Accords, the peace camp in Israel once influenced events. Today, support for a two-state solution has dropped dramatically. Hopes for peace are vanishing as Israel is embroiled in a terrible war in Gaza, governed by the most right-wing coalition in its history. What happened to the Israeli left is next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The Israeli peace camp basically suffered a domestic delegitimization. And Israelis, the majority of Israelis began to sound on the idea that Palestinians should have their own independent state, which they viewed as inherently focused on the destruction of Israel. And it's been a very, very tough argument to make in Israel ever since then.
Hundreds of thousands of protesters packed the streets in Israel, enraged at the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu, demanding that he agree to a deal for the return of the remaining hostages who have been held by Hamas since October 7. The demonstrations were sparked by the discovery of the bodies of 6 hostages in Gaza, all murdered by Hamas as rescuers closed in.
To ask Israel to make concessions after this murder is to send a message to Hamas: murder more hostages, you'll get more concessions.
Now, a large majority of Israelis want Netanyahu gone, but this does not mean they're all on the left of Israeli politics. Nor does it mean most support a two-state solution that could bring about sustainable peace and coexistence with Palestinians. A Gallup poll taken 2.5 months after October 7, when emotions were still raw, found that only 25% of Israeli adults support a two-state solution. That figure was 61% in 2012. The poll also found 74% do not expect a permanent peace between the two sides. How times have changed since the more optimistic years of the 1990s, after the signing of the Oslo Accords, 1993.
This signing of the Israeli-Palestinian Declaration of Principle here today, it's not so easy. Neither for myself, as a soldier in Israel's war, nor for the people of Israel, not to the Jewish people in the diaspora, who are watching us now with great hope mixed with apprehension.
That may have been the finest hour for the peace camp, whose origins on Israel's left date to the aftermath of the June War in 1967. The outcome left Israel occupying Palestinian territories, including Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. In the introduction to their book, The Independent Left in Israel, 1967 to 1993, Matan Kaminer and Joel Benin write the 1967 war redrew the political map of the Middle East. From that moment on, the future of the occupied territories became the issue of the day for the left in Israel. Nevertheless, they write, only a handful of political factions spoke out against Israel's plan to settle the territories. In the 1970s, the group Peace Now was formed after about 350 officers and soldiers from the Israeli army signed an open letter to Prime Minister Begin, urging him to make peace with Egypt. The Camp David Accords of 1978 with Begin, Egypt's Anwar Sadat, and President Jimmy Carter were also supposed to lead to a resolution of the Palestinian issue.
It deals specifically with the future of the West Bank and Gaza and the need to resolve the Palestinian problem in all its aspects. The framework document proposes a 5-year transitional period in the West Bank and Gaza, during which the Israeli military government will be withdrawn and a self-governing authority will be elected with full autonomy. It also provides for Israeli forces to remain in specified locations during this period to protect Israel's security.
Israel did not end its occupation, and the first Palestinian uprising, or Intifada, began in 1987. The Israeli activist and politician Naomi Shazan calls the period 1987 to 1993 the heyday of the peace camp, after 2 decades when Israeli society had been complacent about the Palestinian issue. Those early advocates of an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue faced a lot of obstacles. It was illegal to even speak to the PLO. The idea of a two-state solution did not enjoy much support. Decision-makers could ignore the peace activists, until, as mentioned, the First Intifada. Shazan says relations with Palestinians abruptly became a national issue, and the first Israeli organizations defending the rights of Palestinians were established. Some groups called for an end to the occupation. Others wanted to see a Palestinian state, but they all agreed that Israeli and Palestinian leaders needed to start talking directly. These calls for action penetrated the political establishment, and the momentum for change brought Yitzhak Rabin to power in 1992. It did not last.
Shocking news from the Middle East tonight. Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has been assassinated.
There was a poll published today that indicated 80% of the public in Israel, the Jewish public of Israel, supports implementation of the Oslo Accords. Mr. Netanyahu must give this attention.
By 2000, the peace process had failed to produce an agreement.
After 14 days of intensive negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time.
And the Second Intifada followed, discrediting the peace process. Now, peace activists and left-wing parties did not disappear, and they're still around, but they lack the influence they had then. Why? We're going to discuss it now with Dahlia Scheindlin. She is a political strategist and a public opinion expert who has advised on 9 national campaigns in Israel and in 15 other countries. She is a regular columnist at Haaretz newspaper's English edition and the author of The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, published in September 2023. She also co-authored an essay last June for Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, titled Israel's Annexation of the West Bank Has Already Begun. I'll include a link to her essay in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack. Dahlia Scheindlin, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you are joining us from Tel Aviv.
Yes.
So what is the mood there right now? We are speaking here in early September. I often remind listeners who might be listening to this show weeks or months afterward, things have changed since we recorded, but we know that there were massive protests in Israel after Hamas murdered the 6 hostages. The anger directed at the Netanyahu government.
The mood is very tense. There have been demonstrations ongoing for many months now. Usually they're on Saturday nights, and there are 2 parallel demonstrations in Tel Aviv. One is a demonstration led by the families of hostages, and it's very somber, basically begging the government to prioritize the hostages. And that's been going on for many, many months. The other demonstration, however, every Saturday night, and it's a much more activist, angry, noisy, rowdy demonstration that is both demanding prioritization of the hostages and a hostage release ceasefire deal, but also deeply critical of the government and demanding elections and the ouster of Netanyahu. That has been the situation for all these months, certainly throughout 2024. But after the murder of the 6 hostages, who all Israelis came to know because their families happen to be particularly public in their activism, and really worked day and night to get every Israeli to feel close to those particular hostages, Israelis were just devastated. People felt like they had lost their own family members. The pain was huge and the anger was huge. And at that point, the number of people who spontaneously organized and mobilized was tremendous. I mean, I think everybody who'd ever gone to a demonstration was getting notifications from every single social media platform and WhatsApp group. And everybody, I mean, not everybody, but certainly a great number of people went out to demonstrate immediately after the Saturday night when we found out about the 6 hostages. So Sunday night, the demonstrations, according to reports, reached about 300,000 people. And I believe it because I was there. It was an extremely dense crush of people that flooded a main boulevard called Begin Boulevard. And I think that there was also a sense of very high anticipation because the leader of the major labor union, the Histadrut, announced a general strike for the next day, which was Monday. You know, there was a real sense that social mobilization would be something the government couldn't ignore. But then on Monday evening, the Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a very combative speech, digging in and insisting on one of the key conditions that has been, frankly, a recent condition that he has placed for reaching a ceasefire hostage release deal, by which Israel would remain in control of what we call the Philadelphia Passage or corridor. It's not actually a passage, it's the Philadelphia route that separates Gaza from Egypt, you know, and basically arguing to the Israeli public that this is the cornerstone of Israeli security. There is no way Israel will leave the Philadelphia route. And that has become a complete deal breaker for a deal. And as a result, Israelis heard from his speech, there will be no hostage release deal. The demonstrators who had poured out all over the country, I should say, not only in Tel Aviv, but in Jerusalem as well, were infuriated. They felt like it was a death sentence to the 101 remaining hostages. Protesters were lighting bonfires in the middle of Tel Aviv and in the middle of Jerusalem. And I would say that was definitely a spontaneous expression of their anguish, but also somehow threatening, not because I think anybody really intended to do physical damage, but a sense of just how pain people feel and how absolutely agonizing the situation is and how much they are demanding that the government prioritize hostages. We should also remember, however, that there is a portion of Israelis, it's a minority, but it's not a small minority, who do not think Israel should make these concessions to Hamas, and who agree with the Prime Minister that after the murder of the 6 hostages who we knew were alive up until just a couple of days before, that the Prime Minister's argument that there should be no reward, no concessions. There's a portion of Israelis who agree with the Prime Minister on that. Again, by all surveys, it's a minority, but that just means that both sides are very, very heavily and passionately, viscerally dug into their positions. The hostages have become an extremely politicized issue. Of course, the violence goes on. There's massive escalation in the West Bank. The Israeli army has been carrying out the most severe operation in the West Bank in 20 years. And there is a rising threat of Hamas ratcheting up the threat through suicide bombs. There's the northern border always poised to explode with Hezbollah. And so it is all around a very, very precarious situation.
Well, it seems that Benjamin Netanyahu is bent on continuing the war until, in his view, Hamas has been destroyed. What that looks like, I can't tell you. What is holding up the ceasefire? Everyone has their own view on this. But here in the U.S., many on the left are blaming Netanyahu, that he has the power to end hostilities and get the hostages back, but he refuses to.
We don't want to understate the difficulty of this dilemma. The most obvious problem with reaching a ceasefire deal that is based on hostage release in return for Palestinian prisoners and various other concessions regarding a continuation of the war from Israel's perspective. I think the biggest, most obvious answer is that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza and the architect of the October 7th attacks, was himself released in a hostage release deal in 2011, which Netanyahu essentially is the one who put that deal together. That was in return for Gilad Shalit, a soldier who had been kidnapped in 2006. And it took 5 years to get him released, and 1,027 Palestinian prisoners were released, among them Yahya Sinwar. And so, you know, there is a strong argument to be made that any Palestinian prisoner release deal in return for hostages could actually endanger Israeli security because of the individual identity of people released, and also because it provides an incentive for precisely this kind of hostage taking, which is why hostage taking is not in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or in Israel's other conflicts in the region. It's a very significant dilemma. That is an initial dilemma, even unrelated to the war. And I think that remains one of the strongest arguments for the people who are against a deal. However, Netanyahu has added all sorts of additional dilemmas. All of them have, I think, legitimate arguments, And the question then becomes who actually wants to reach the deal, who wants to get to yes. Okay, so Netanyahu's conditions have been that he doesn't want to end the war. He doesn't want to commit to a complete end of the war. He wants better conditions for the different stages. He wants to get more living hostages during the first stage. And more recently, and this is one of the major accusations because it appears to be one of the more objective obstacles coming from Netanyahu, he has insisted that Israel retain control over the Philadelphia route, as we talked about before, which is the line essentially separating Gaza from Egypt. Much of the armament that Hamas has managed to build up over the years were smuggled. And so Netanyahu has been saying that that Israel must retain control of the Philadelphia corridor, or there can be no deal, because if Israel relinquishes control, that means Hamas can rearm, and that would undermine the initial goal of destroying Hamas's military and governing capacity. There was a convincing argument that the Philadelphia corridor is a vulnerability, but Netanyahu only seemed to remember that the Philadelphia corridor is the entire cornerstone to Israel's existential survival over the last number of weeks. Whereas in previous rounds, particularly with relation to the framework that President Biden had outlined on the 31st of May, it was understood as something that Israel could cope with if it thinned out its forces or allowed various other forms of technology and other kinds of barriers with guarantees from other countries to help secure that area. Now, I don't think this lets Yahya Sinwar and Hamas off the hook for responsibility. Let's just remember that taking civilian hostages is a war crime that has been condemned by every international organization, and rightfully so. There should not be civilian hostages held. And you and I can have an opinion about what should happen in the war right now. People can believe there should be a ceasefire. I personally have been calling for a ceasefire since November. I publicly think there should be a ceasefire and an end to this war. But when Hamas is starting from a maximalist position and continually returns to the maximalist position after having committed a war crime, it has to take responsibility for that too. Now, Hamas's argument lately has been that Hamas agreed to the May 31st outline and that Netanyahu then piled on additional conditions in every way. There's some evidence of that from within Netanyahu's own circles. When it comes down to that fundamental question of which side wants to get to yes, it's hard for me to speak to Hamas's perspective, but I can tell you that Netanyahu has made it very clear he does not intend to end this war. When he says the four aims, three of them with relation to Gaza, destroying Hamas's governing and military capacities, making sure that Hamas can never threaten Israel again from Gaza, and getting the hostages back, there's no clear endpoint or definition as to what it means to say Hamas's capacities have been fully destroyed. He has not defined that. He refuses to talk about what should happen in Gaza the next day, and he refuses to cooperate on thinking about who would rule Gaza afterwards. Not that Israel should be able to make that decision, in my opinion, but if there is no acceptance of an alternative governing power that is not Israel, then there's only two conclusions we can make. Either Israel doesn't want to end the war at all, or that Israel intends to continue the war, which is overlapping with the first, and rule Gaza itself. And we're seeing evidence of that. I mean, Netanyahu's coalition partners have said time and again that they want to reoccupy, conquer, and rebuild settlements in Gaza. His coalition partners are not hiding that. Netanyahu himself has a different way of saying what I consider to be very much the same thing. He says we will not give up on Israeli security control of Gaza. That's become a bit of a euphemism. It sort of implies that Israel will only hold security control while Palestinians can govern their military affairs. But as we know from the West Bank, there's no real separation between those things. Once Israel is permanently there as an occupying military power, it has effective control over every area of civilian life. And just today, as we're speaking, there was an expose in Israeli news that the Israeli army there have been instructions or considerations from the political level that the Israeli army would take over humanitarian aid distribution in Gaza, which is an extremely, extremely sensitive option. I have written about this as far back as January, February, saying that because this was an idea proposed by Netanyahu's extremist, ultra-nationalist, theocratic, authoritarian coalition partner, Bezalel Smotrich, who's the Minister of Finance, Smotrich said openly back in January, February, that the IDF should take responsibility for humanitarian aid. He has repeated this numerous times because he thinks it should form the basis of a military government, which is essentially establishing a permanent presence for reoccupation of Gaza. Those coalition partners are not hiding their intentions, and I think that has to be taken seriously.
So the issue of occupation and the West Bank, we're going to return to that in a bit because you wrote an essay for Foreign Affairs about how the annexation, in your view, of the West Bank is already underway. But we're going to talk now about a related subject to what we've been discussing. Where is the Israeli left? Where is the peace camp? Maybe we can start at the beginning briefly. The founding of Israel in 1948. Then in 1967, Israel, after the Six-Day War, is now in occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and some other places as well. Post-1967, is that where we see the formation of the first organized peace movement in Israel, Peace Now, in the 1970s? And what sparked its creation?
I think that's a fair way of putting it, although there was always a division or, differences of opinion, I would say, going back to the founding of statehood. I mean, it goes right down to the UN General Assembly Resolution 181, which we know as the partition plan, when the Zionist leadership had to decide whether it would accept a proposal to divide mandatory Palestine, which is what we now call the land from the river to the sea, to sort of detoxify what is an accurate geographic, geohistorical description. And the Zionist leadership had to decide whether that was acceptable. And the compromise that was offered for dividing the land, according to that partition plan, offered about 55% of the territory to what it called the Jewish state at the time, and about 45% to what it called at the time the Arab state, what we call the Palestinians. And, this was seen as unacceptable to the Arab leadership, the Arab Higher Committee and the other Arab states, because they said, well, the Jews are a minority of the population, only about a third of the entire population between the river and the sea. Why should they have more of the land? And the Zionist leadership, for its part, said our entire, national and historic and mythological and religious and sentimental and, the continuity of our people rests on the entire land. So for them, for each side, there would have been a compromise. And the Zionist leadership eventually decided to take that compromise. But I would say there were always political / differences of opinion between the more maximalist camps within Israeli political life. The revisionist movement, which is the forerunner to today's Likud, Netanyahu's party, not only wanted the entire land of Mandate Palestine, but they had an old slogan of looking at both banks of the Jordan based on what they assessed as biblical lands belonging to the tribes of Israel. And we know that in Israel's founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence, in its basic laws, Israel never did pass a cohesive written constitutional document. There is no definition of Israel's actual final borders. During the War of Independence, Israel conquered further territories beyond the original 55%. And those territories were eventually recognized as sovereign Israeli territory based on internationally brokered agreements that ended the war in 1949, 1950. And so that's what we know of as sovereign Israel. But there have always been Israelis who wanted more. Then, of course, when Israel conquered additional territories in 1967, and let's just review, we're including the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, there were many Israelis from that political / religious camp, because these were also seen as biblically promised lands, who thought that this was a miracle. Okay, a miracle that fit into kind of a cosmic divine plan for the redemption of the land by the Jewish people, and believed that that was a sign that Israel must possess those lands. And thus we had the birth of the settler movement driven by religious leaders. But because there was always a residual element within the Israeli secular leadership that wanted greater territories of the original Mandate Palestine, there was always a kind of cooperation, collusion, backing of the state for the settler leaders. Some of the settlers themselves were secular. We tend to be more familiar with the religiously driven settlers. And by that logic, they began settling territories in the West Bank and Gaza, also in the Golan Heights, which was conquered from Syria. And it was in the late 70s, as Israel was beginning to have conversations with Anwar Sadat of Egypt, and it looked more likely that there would be some movement towards a peace agreement with Egypt, that a group of Israelis, many of them former officers, said, made a public statement and said the settlements are going to lead to a permanent Israeli control over the West Bank and Gaza, whereas we want to have peace with our Palestinian neighbors. I think they probably used the term Arab at the time. Therefore, they were against the settlements and for political resolution of the occupation with the Palestinians, of ending the occupation. And they were hoping that that would take place alongside the negotiations with Egypt. Of course, the first Camp David agreement with Egypt, the negotiations that took place in Camp David did include, an early stage plan for Palestinian autonomy. It's not something the Palestinians would support now, but the point is that that was ultimately left out and never implemented.
The Palestinians will have the right to participate in the determination of their own future in negotiations which will resolve the final status of the West Bank and Gaza.
And as a result, eventually under the Likud government, which won power in 1977, settlements continued to grow. They had been established by then, but they continued to grow and expanded with greater and greater state backing in numerous ways, which we can talk about. And as a result, I think that what you're calling the peace movement, which we did call it the peace movement for a long time, we practically don't call it that anymore. But more and more Israelis began to say, the occupation is bad for Israel. The occupation itself is a military regime that implicates so many Israelis in a people's army, is bad for Israel's democracy, bad for its society. We are becoming an occupying people. And alongside that, the Jewish leaders of the peace camp said, if we end up with a permanent grip over those Palestinian territories, in 1967, that included 1 million Palestinians. Today, it's roughly 5 million, over 5 million Palestinians, in addition to Palestinian citizens within Israel. Their argument was that Israel will essentially be one state controlling the whole land, and there will be either an equal number of Palestinians and Jews, or even more Palestinians than Jews. It will be one state. It will not be a Jewish state, not demographically. And eventually, if it's going to retain anything like a free voting system, then there will be no Jewish government. There will be a Palestinian majority, and Jews won't even have a sense of self-determination based on the demographic majority. That was the major argument of the peace camp throughout the 1970s by Zionist Jews. Let's say there was a sense of progress for the peace camp and maybe an early stage victory with the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, which for the peace camp was a sign that the government had acknowledged their points and was prepared to begin to draw down the occupation with an eye towards essentially ending the occupation.
Yesterday, a dream. Today, a commitment. The Israeli and the Palestinian peoples, who fought each other for almost a century, have agreed to move decisively on the path of dialogue, understanding, and cooperation.
By the mid-1990s, there was significant violence. The accords ultimately were kind of frozen in various ways. There was one more major push in the year 2000 to reach what we then began to call a two-state solution between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. That process fell apart.
I had a conversation with Chairman Arafat. I talked with him and Prime Minister Barak yesterday. I try to, I talk to them several times a week now. And one of the things we need to do is to have people who are interested in violence off the streets, people who are interested in ending the violence out there doing what they're capable of doing.
There had already been one Palestinian uprising in the late 80s and early 90s. Then there was a second Palestinian uprising in the Intifada, which was extremely violent. The Israeli peace camp basically suffered a domestic delegitimization. And Israelis, the majority of Israelis began to sound on the idea that Palestinians should have their own independent state, which they viewed as inherently focused on the destruction of Israel. And it's been a very, very tough argument to make in Israel ever since then.
So Peace Now comes together in 1978, and you did mention Oslo, 1993, and what happened after that. But is it right to say that it wasn't until the First Intifada, 1987, that the plight of Palestinians gained mainstream recognition, awareness in Israeli society, that before that, many Israelis weren't quite aware of just what life was like under the occupation?
It's a mixed picture because remember, the Palestinian cause was something Israelis were aware of. The PLO was established in the early 1960s, even before 1967. And the PLO emerged from the Palestinian diaspora community around the Middle East and for a time essentially tried a sort of rebel force to conduct series of terror attacks. And so Israelis knew about the issue, but I think that they assumed it would never gain any credibility because they were mainly using the tactic of violence and terror, and Israelis thought that they didn't have to take it seriously for that reason. And I don't think they viewed them as a nation or a people, which is something that plagues Israeli society to this day. They have a very strong resistance to accepting that Palestinians are a nation. So they knew about the problem, but in terms of life under occupation, it gets more complicated. I mean, certainly during the first 20 years, the occupation looked somewhat different from the way it is now. There was somewhat more, freedom would be too strong a word, of course, because it was a military occupation and not a matter of self-determination. But there was more mobility for Palestinians. Israelis and Palestinians could cross pretty easily into one another's territories. This was part of the theory of how to manage the occupation, to allow Palestinians to come in and work in Israel, which actually did contribute to economic benefits. I am not justifying military occupation, but it was a very different environment. They could sort of tell themselves, no, it wasn't so bad, at least if they wanted to convince themselves of that. But that's why many Israelis were surprised. If you talk to them, those who remember that in 1987, there was all of a sudden a rebellion. They hadn't expected Palestinians to have national consciousness and to long for their own self-determination. it made them realize that the situation could not be stable, that there would be an uprising. Things would not go simply, coast along according to a kind of peaceful coexistence of Israelis having their state and Palestinians living under military occupation forever. The occupation, in many ways, during the Oslo years, and certainly after the Second Intifada, but even during the Oslo years, became more stringent and more limiting and more constricting for Palestinian life.
And the settlements even continued during those years as well when they weren't supposed to, or at least there were some verbal commitments on the part of the Israelis not to continue the settlements. But something does happen there in the 1990s. Rabin is assassinated and Netanyahu wins a very narrow election in 1996. That's a big part of the story as to what happens to the Israeli left.
Well, there's a big part of the story. I mean, I think there are two major parts of the story. It's true that Israel absolutely, it wasn't just a verbal commitment. I mean, the Oslo Accord specified that neither side should do anything to prejudice the outcome of final status, which means Israel should not have been expanding settlements. The Israeli prime minister was then assassinated, we should point out for listeners who might not know, by a far-right extremist Israeli Jew, not by a Palestinian. And that, shook Israeli society very deeply, but that assassin emerged out of an environment of severe opposition to the Oslo process. And that was largely spurred on by Palestinians, particularly Hamas, who opposed the Oslo Accords, conducting a series of suicide bombings against Israeli civilians. That's a critical part of the picture. I mean, it's one thing to make an argument for or against the Oslo Accords, for or against ending occupation, for or against a Palestinian state, but you can't ignore the impact of a bomb going off on a civilian bus in the middle of the country or a shopping mall or killing children, which is exactly what happened many, many times. And that gave major fuel to the anti-Oslo, the opponents of Oslo on the Israeli side. So all of that began to seem, to Israelis like the issue was very divisive. The idea of a peace process actually caused greater harm to Israelis. And that all of those things together led eventually to the election of Netanyahu, who was generally opposed to the Oslo Accords from the beginning. And he didn't exactly end them right away, but he certainly slowed them down and essentially brought them to something like a standstill, although he did implement other incremental parts of them. Yeah. And we think that at the time there was still a willingness in major parts of Israeli society to get back on track to a peace process of some sort, which is why in 1999, Ehud Barak was elected as the head of the Labour Party on a promise of reviving the peace process. That's where you have a much more complicated story of the failure of the more significant negotiating efforts to get to a two-state solution. The two sides are trading blame to this day over who was responsible and what might have happened if the agreements had been signed in the year 2000, but they weren't. And then we have, the phase of the Second Intifada. But throughout that phase, from the collapse of that negotiation in the year 2000 to the present, the settler population has essentially doubled. There are over 700,000 Israelis now living beyond the Green Line, if you include East Jerusalem, which many of them don't, but that, is technically still occupied territory. And, there are constant efforts to expand settlements, to kind of connect those areas, cut the West Bank in half, and strategically locate settlements in ways that will forever end any possibility of a contiguous Palestinian state. And that makes things severely more complicated for ever trying to revive that kind of solution today.
How have demographic changes, immigration to Israel, helped the growth of, say, the Israeli right and diminished the Israeli left?
Very common question. And I think that to explain the argument, many people are under the impression that because Israel has a large population of people who immigrated to Israel in the 1950s from Middle East and North African countries that did not have a democratic tradition, and then two major waves, but particularly the biggest wave of former Soviet Jews, many of them also non-Jews, who came from the former Soviet Union during the 1990s. There was an earlier wave in the 1970s. Those were also people who came from countries without a democratic tradition. It's often assumed that as a result, there are just too many populations that don't prioritize, democratic or liberal values, and therefore they support sort of right-wing, hawkish, views of the Middle East being a place where people only understand military force, have racist views towards Arabs. We think this case is overstated. And I will explain why. I think that Israel has failed to develop a deep and fundamental commitment to basic democratic principles from its earliest years. With or without the waves of immigration, Israel did not sufficiently commit itself to the pillars of democracy, going through many of the significant practices of a robust democracy, such as free elections, regular free and fair elections, at least for its citizens. And even then, in the beginning, only part of its citizens had free elections, because going back to the earliest years, Arab citizens were under military rule as well. But the fact is, demography is not destiny. And people should never have depended on demography for democratic commitment. If Israel had fully committed itself in more profound ways, normalizing democratic values, embracing them, and enshrining them in a constitution, I think waves of immigrants can be socialized into a democratic tradition. I would say, if anything, it's more like the populations who came from less democratic countries and less democratic traditions were, very often prone to the campaigns of parties that were expansionist, advocating annexation and settlements, and diminishing the importance of democratic rule or anything like Palestinian self-determination or rights, which are fundamentally connected. Simply implementing this undemocratic occupation regime definitely undercuts the value placed on democracy. And I think that is implicated into populations that didn't have a strong democratic tradition to begin with. But I would not blame their demography. People's background is part of their culture, their socialization, and those things can change over time if the country had wanted to.
I think a lot of listeners will be surprised to hear you say that, because here in the United States, where we just hear all the time, in like the halls of Congress, this is often said by members of both parties, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. We must stand by it. The Israeli left today, you said there are 120 seats in the Knesset. How many are the peace camp? It would seem like very few.
It's maybe not as few as you think. For one thing, let's talk about self-definition. When you ask people how they define themselves as left, right, or center, you have just under 20%, sometimes even 20%, who identify themselves as left-wing, which by definition in Israel is always, first of all, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, meaning they support peace through negotiation and a political agreement. You have another 25% who consider themselves centrist. And up until October 7th, the majority of those people basically accepted a two-state solution, would have been content in the occupation if they were assured that there would be a political agreement that was agreed on by both sides and ended the conflict, and didn't support settlements or expansion or annexation. And even a small portion of the right wing, if they were assured of security first, would have accepted something like a compromise for the sake of a political agreement. And that's why for much of Israel's last 20 years, up until about 2018, you still had a majority of Israelis who supported a two-state solution. So when you talk about the peace camp, it's somewhere between the low point of the self-defined left, the high point of what used to be a majority up until just a few years ago, who supported a two-state solution. And back in the year 2010, which isn't that long ago, 7% of Israelis supported a two-state solution. And then you have what your original question was: what portion of Israelis are willing to vote for parties that prioritize reaching a two-state solution? And there it's much lower. You currently have 9 seats out of 120 that went to the parties who are typically viewed as Arab majority parties in Israel, and they fundamentally support reaching a peace agreement. You have 4 seats that went to the Labour Party, the old historic party that once ruled the country. Only 4 seats, it barely crossed the electoral threshold. However, centrist parties, for example, the party of Yair Lapid, which is the second biggest party in the outgoing Knesset. We have to remember the outgoing Knesset, it's not outgoing yet, but it was the second biggest party in the 2022 elections. That is a party that, whose leader was the last prime minister to openly state that he supported a two-state solution from the halls of the United Nations, just as recently as September 2022. Now, it may not be the same vision of a two-state solution that Palestinians would accept. It certainly isn't. The leader of that party is certainly not doing as well in surveys these days, and has, only barely mentioned the idea of getting back to a two-state solution in highly qualified ways, if ever. He's barely mentioned it since the war. But these are constituencies that could be brought around to supporting this kind of a solution under the right conditions. So, I would be a little bit cautious about assuming there's nobody left.
And also on the Palestinian side, it's been pointed out to me that support for a two-state solution has also dropped dramatically in recent years. So,
yeah, absolutely. These are parallel mirror images of the trend on both sides.
So in your essay in Foreign Affairs, which I will share in my weekly newsletter, you state that the annexation of the West Bank has already begun, something that was overlooked in, well, at least here in the United States from my vantage point. I didn't even know that this had happened. In February of 2023, the Israeli government, as you describe it, an ultranationalist coalition government, agreed on what a new minister should do in the West Bank, a civilian minister for civilian authority over life in the West Bank. Why is this so important?
Essentially ripping off the veil. In other words, Israel has established a presence through settlements, but also through bureaucratic hold, through extension of Israeli law in various ways, in ways that apply to, that are sort of tailored to place Israeli settlers living in the West Bank at this point, because settlers have left Gaza in 2005, under civilian rule. Now, that creates a two-tiered system. According to international law, all occupied territory should be governed by a temporary administration. Otherwise, we're looking at annexation, conquering territory through military force, which is a violation of international law and the UN Charter, under any interpretation. Okay, the entire international system in ways was set up in order to prevent countries from conquering and annexing territory by force. But if it's a temporary military occupation, it isn't necessarily illegal as long as there's no sign that the country, that the occupier is trying to permanently establish its hold. But if it extends its civilian authorities, the regular authorities of the state, whether those authorities come in the form of physical presence or laws, then it is essentially a form of annexation. Now, that's why civilian settlements have long been considered almost across the board, except for certain members of the Trump administration, as a violation of international law, because they signal that Israel is trying to establish a permanent presence through civilian establishments in occupied territory, which it then has found ways to extend civilian law to govern. And that, of course, does create a two-tiered system where Palestinians live under military law and all sorts of layers of patchwork layers of laws, none of which are democratic and none of which they have a say. And that does affect everybody in the West Bank, regardless of the Oslo breakdown. But what this government did was basically say, we are no longer going to continue this kind of fiction that it's a temporary military occupation that might one day end. And it was a fiction. The international community essentially chose not to see it and to tell itself that Israel was essentially, other than these illegal settlements, was essentially still a temporary military presence. But this government said, we're actually going to transfer the powers that the Israeli military holds theoretically to govern everything in the West Bank. The military is supposed to be what is ultimately like a sovereign power, even though it shouldn't be called sovereign. We're going to transfer some of those powers to a civilian minister. That is basically extending the arm of the regular Israeli state to formally govern Israelis who live there and have a lot of control over Palestinians who live in those areas as well, particularly in Area C. But of course, any decision by the Israeli government can affect all sorts of aspects of Palestinian life anywhere in the West Bank. That essay was over a year ago now. In the meantime, that person, who is Bezalel Smotrich, the head of the ultranationalist, extremist, theocratic party, a sort of messianic annexationist, expansionist party, has taken it upon himself to accelerate the bureaucratic process of approving new settlements, of approving settlement expansion, and facilitating all of the necessary infrastructure to facilitate settlement life in what they call Judea and Samaria, what everybody else calls the West Bank. That means that it's ever harder for Palestinians to have any livelihood and development. And transferring those powers to a civilian minister is essentially saying, we never intend to give up on this territory. It is a form of annexation through bureaucratic means that can be so complicated that maybe people won't really notice. Still, this government transferring those powers to a civilian minister is essentially saying, we are open about this now. We are not hiding our intentions anymore. And in fact, they said it right in their coalition agreements that were signed in late December 2022. They agreed to have that transfer of powers to a civilian ministry, taking these administrative powers away from what is always called the civil administration, but what was a military body, and stating, in very, very clear terms in the coalition agreements that this government would be committed to expanding Jewish settlement and the exclusive right of Jewish self-determination to all areas of the land of Israel, including Judea and Samaria. They didn't mention Gaza at the time, but don't worry, they've made up for it now ever since October 7th by stating and restating the very same intentions with relation to Gaza. So there can be no illusions anymore, and this is having a material impact on the ground all the time as settlements are expanding and cutting through what used to be greater bureaucracy and sometimes even obstacles, expanding more settlements. And I should say that underneath the letter of the law, there is a kind of tacit approval for the most violent and fringe radical element of settlers who are becoming increasingly emboldened in undertaking violent acts against Palestinians in Area C, which is, of course, part of a cycle of violence. Palestinians are committing more attacks against Israelis in the West Bank as well. And increasingly, this is leading to friction that's fueling attempts at attacks within the green line, if there is such a thing anymore. Most Israelis couldn't tell you where the green line is anymore. But this is certainly contributing to a cycle of violence. If that violence escalates, as it already is, there's no question that this government will then plead to the escalating violence and say, you see, we need to completely annex and take over the West Bank to the fullest possible extent, just the way we are now claiming we need to do in Gaza. And so that's what everybody should be on the lookout for. It's in many ways, it's happening day to day as we speak.
On the next episode of History as It Happens. Since last October, the IDF and Israeli settlers have killed hundreds of Palestinians on the West Bank with impunity. We'll discuss the origins of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and its future as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.